Right, this is my mother, Brenda, when I think it was either a 21st birthday photo or when she got engaged, and that was when she was 21 as well. And she was doing her very own Who Do You Think You Are with Vicky and with Alicia's father, long before anybody thought of a TV series. At the time of this photo, all she knew was that she was the daughter of Fred Broome, and she was the granddaughter of John and Agnes Broome. In the middle of that photo we've already seen. Her father Fred is front left with the tennis racket. So when she first became interested, that's all she knew, but she was to find out that her grandmother Agnes was a Trethewey, and that she was the... Sorry, I got that wrong, haven't I? She was the great-granddaughter of Samuel Trethewey, and that's his pumping station at Crumford. I've often wondered what prompted her passion for the family's past. It wasn't always there. Got this slight jolt when Daisy died, and everybody did fantastic family trees for the solicitors. But at that time, she didn't even know that her father was sixth in the family of 11. She couldn't say where he came. And at that time, my generation was very busy producing the next generation. That's the first 5 of her grandchildren. 6 more came in rapid succession. And I think she was so busy going from one family to another to look after the next newborn that she didn't have much time for the past. And she did have some strange myths about the family history. She was certain we were descended from Richard Trevithick, which isn't true. But Samuel Trethewey did install an pumping engine, designed by Richard Trevithick, and I think that was the link. She also actually was sure we were descended from William IV, but that's not true either. And I found the source of that mystery, and I can see where the muddle came. So Alicia, who's here tonight, has a very quite unusual relationship with me. She's a double second cousin. And there are actually 3 Broome siblings, married 3 Mortimer siblings. So there are 3 double connections between the family. And I think this spurred very much my mother's interest in family history on both sides. And Alaric, Alicia's father, had a wonderful collection, obviously, of photographs. He'd also kept very closely in touch with the cousins and the Broome diaspora a bit. And my mother didn't seem to have that same collection at all. I think partly because, I'll come to that later, but her parents' house had to be sold very quickly after her father's death, and I think a lot of stuff was just not kept, and a lot of connections went. But among other people, Alaric put my mother in touch with Nicky Cunningham, who had this wonderful informed enthusiasm for family history, which was a good foil to my mother's rather less rigorous approach. But across the generations, based at right the other end of the country, they had this amazing correspondence, absolutely masses of letters. And I think it was through Nicky that my mother realised she was a Trethewey, and that's where, absolutely nothing to do with Trevithick. So she had this wonderful fascination for her forebears, unusually clear childhood memories, and a real determination to actually write it down. So this became a chicken and egg, because she wanted things to write about. And we've often told the older generation, I'm sure, and I'm even telling one of my older siblings to write it down, because it's history and it gets lost and it's so sad. Anyway, after my father's death, sorry, not my death. She joined a tutored writing group. So this was another thing. She had to produce writing, because if the writing group didn't publish something most years, then the tutor lost the funding and the group would have been disbanded. And this was in about the sort of 1980s, and that's the photograph of her then. My father died in early August 1987, and only by late September of that year, she and I were here at this mill in Matlock doing a tour. And that's the letter inviting us to come. From Marsden Smedley, and he arranged a tour just for the 2 of us. We didn't have to be a big group. We did an absolute whistle-stop 2 days. Both the family homes, that's her first home, the Shaws in Matlock, and she also lived at hillside, which I think is now a bit of a university or something. And we went to Cromford and the pumping station. There's canal boats and... Oh, that's a later one, sorry. Go back to canal boats. There we are. She'd set everything up in a fantastic flurry of correspondence. 2 days. I was exhausted and she was absolutely fine. So for this writing group, one of the things she wrote was... That's actually Dethick Church, where we think John Broome was baptised. And that's Lee Hall, which we saw. And these are two family photos of the Fred Broome and his siblings when they were living at Lee Home. And the top row, we think, is Harriet, my Auntie Tatty, and Agnes. And the bottom row is Mary, then Fred, then May. And that one is the top is Fred, obviously, and the two ladies are May and Agnes. So this is a picture from this was my mother's youngest sister, and this is her in her christening robe, and it was included in her writing, which she called Child's Eye View, which was about her early childhood in Matlock. And it has lots of very, very minute domestic detail because she had this wonderful childhood memory and all sorts of incidents with friends and obviously a lot with her father. Another thing she loved to write about was when she had sort of coincidences happened in her life. She loved that sort of thing. And she wrote a charming piece called Crumbs Cast Upon the Waters. She'd written a piece for the Derbyshire Family History Society, which is about Samuel Trethewey, and it's called A Cornishman in Derbyshire. And because of this, she got contact from somebody called Daphne Slee, who's written a book about the Tretheweys in Canada. I don't know if anybody else has seen it. I've got a copy with me. Yes. Samuel Trethewey had lost his second wife and then actually lost a leg. But he was a Trethewey, so he moved on. He emigrated to Canada to join younger family members. And because of this contact with Daphne Slee, my mother was able to fill in that branch of the family and learnt all the successes that family had there. And she wrote at the time, "My small crumbs had returned to me with interest indeed." But actually a year or two later, she had compound interest because she was invited by Alan and Vivian Trethewey to go and stay with them near Vancouver. So she took the first long-haul flight of her life, in the last year of her life, in fact, and they, absolutely wonderful, they just took her everywhere and showed her everything, and that's two photos from that time. And this is the Trethewey family house near Vancouver, which in Abbotsford, and that's been donated as a museum to the local authority or whatever by Alan. I haven't said much more about the Tretheweys because I find they're incredibly well documented, and that the family tree that Nicky produced years and years ago is just absolutely vast. And in fact, my son found that one of his best friends at school was called Varco, but he was actually a Trethewey, a distant cousin.
Really?
Yes.
Goodness.
But the Broomes, one of the researchers my mother engaged called them those troublesome Broomes. And as Jane and everyone has found, they have been, very difficult to trace. And you have talked about him in Leicester and the fact that he did work here before he went to Leicester and before he came back here. But one thing my mother did, she just put so much effort into it. She wrote to local historians, archivists, genealogists, and she wrote to them in this country and in the New World. And I've got copies of death certificates from Ontario, wills from Liverpool, correspondence from the States, family tree from Haverfordwest, which Nicky thinks is different Broomes, unfortunately, and a company report from a Trethewey cobalt mine in Canada. But I do find it fascinating that we're looking for Broomes, because I imagine that if his mother had been able to give him any other name at the time of his baptism, she'd have been delighted, and we'd actually have been looking for another family. But he was a Broome, and so we're Broomes. So I'm now going to go to my grandfather, the full name Frederick Samuel James Broome, always known as Fred. Obviously didn't have a great time at Smedley's. I don't think it was Mr. Gregory's fault with the dinner ladies. I think it was probably Fred's. But he was the inventor of probably 3 household name brands. His life's a lot easier to document, although it does have some mysteries as well. And my mother's memories were very clear, and she got information from her 2 sisters and also from Alaric's father and Alaric's uncle, who were very close friends. The families were very, very close. And for all his faults, he was a larger-than-life character, and I think I really have to talk a bit about his personal life to put his work problems in perspective. One thing Jane doesn't know about Fred Broome is his first contact with Smedley's, apart from that through his father, when as a young boy, without a word to his family, and terrific worry to his poor mother, he disappeared for a whole day, and he'd actually hitched a ride on the annual Smedley outing to Blackpool. Which is just absolutely Fred, you know. The chemistry in the university we've talked about, but one thing you may have noted, he was born in 1966, he didn't start working here till the 90-something, I think it was. He had actually had a sort of series of gap years which seemed to have lasted about a decade, and he definitely benefited from the Broome Trafui diaspora. He mined for gold in Tierra del Fuego. He worked as a stoker and a gaucho in Argentina. He herded ostriches from there across the Andes to Valparaiso, and he also hunted polar bears in Canada. And Kate, his daughter, remembered him saying that working inside a building when the view went no further than one field did make him long for the open spaces of the pampas. Apparently John Broome had regretted that he'd spent his whole childhood in this relatively small part of England, here in Leicester, his whole life, and he wanted his children to see more of the world. And he gave each of his sons passage to one of the Americas and seed money. He sent the daughters all to finishing school in Europe. Actually, Fred had his seed money stolen as soon as he got to Buenos Aires. I've just reread Daphne Slee's chapter on Samuel Trafui in her book, which is called Go Ahead or Go Home. And you read that and you hear Jane talking about Fred, and actually you can't tell which person is which. I'll just quote a bit. It's here, isn't it? Samuel's independence of mind did not always endear him to his employers. So this could be Fred and his own design of carding machine while he was still supposed to be working here. This is one of Samuel's pumps. So he did, at least when he wanted to invent something, he did invent it or develop it for his employer, which Fred didn't do. But there's another quote about Samuel, and when he was deemed to be exceeding his authority, he was firmly told not to transact any further business and not to leave the mine without permission. But actually Samuel quit that employment very soon after that. Nothing to do with genes, but probably influencing both men's ability to deal with the demands of their working life, particularly the humdrum aspects, were the difficulties in their personal life. Samuel had lost a young son to typhus. Fred lost his first child at weeks old, not quite sure what, but a cot death of some sort. Fred lost a first wife and then a second wife, both at a fairly young age. Fred's marital history is actually the complete antithesis to that. I'm going to quote verbatim from my mother's biography. From their first meeting, Fred and Lucy Mortimer were strongly attracted to each other. She was a vivacious, attractive young woman with a mass of auburn hair. However, Fred never proposed and never proposed. The reason, he had already, in 1888, very unwillingly, contracted a marriage in Buenos Aires. The myth varies, but the accepted one is that it had been a shotgun wedding. Fred had had a girlfriend, she'd had a married man on the scene as well, and there was a baby on the way. We'll never know the whole truth, but Fred could not break that marriage. I mean, she was presumably Catholic. In the end, he took the risk. He proposed to Lucy. She broke off an engagement to another man. No one gave just cause or impediment, and 20 years after that first wedding, he married her here in England. Interestingly, my mother relates, and she couldn't really understand it because she didn't know about this till after he died. When he talked about marriage, he would actually, his marriage to Lucy, he would always talk about committing matrimony, not marrying. And he did play with words, so was this conscious or was it Freudian? I don't know. The first time Fred's British children were to learn of this actual marriage and of their own illegitimacy was after their father's death, when his illegitimate South American daughter made a valid claim on his estate. The fact that that claim was made relatively soon indicates that that family in Buenos Aires had always been in contact with him. He was probably sending money to them. He was possibly being blackmailed. So his personal life really wasn't very straightforward, and the stresses must have had an effect. This rather belies all that, because this apparently, I can't believe it, this is Lucy and her Bible class.
Great.
What a woman. Now, whether I assume they would be mill employees, I don't know, and whether it was this mill or whether it was his own mill, I don't know. Anyway, whatever his personal problems, and whatever Samuel's, it didn't frustrate their ability to invent and innovate. But Fred really did two-time the Smedley company. In August 1910, he was granted a patent on his own behalf. By 1911, this same, I think it's a carding machine, had been patented in, which is that? That's Fred. No, that's the actual patent, that's the British one. And it was patented in France, and it was patented in Germany. So that's France and Germany. And that's the blueprint of the machine he invented. That's a carding machine, is it? Yes, yeah. I've got the patent with me, the actual paperwork. So William Else, this person who it just could have been a connection family-wise, ran this small mill in Matlock, suggested that, and Fred was already in with him. Oh, that's the registration of his company with William Else. And this is the Victoria Hall in Matlock, which had recently and dramatically, although without loss of life, the main floor of it collapsed into its swimming pool. And Mr. Else suggested that Fred buy it and that it become the company mill. So he did that, and that is where he set up Derwent Mills. And it was even in Smedley Street. I mean, I can't believe it. Right under the nose of his employers. I'm also rather afraid he may have pinched some of the skilled workforce while he was at it. They did, to some extent, get his comeuppance because war was declared very soon after this, and his machines had to turn out socks and balaclavas for the troops, and he didn't make much profit. And actually, at long last, his family was arriving. My mother was born in 1914. After the war, his fortunes changed. He invented a way of spinning Angora wool, which is quite difficult because the hairs, even on Angora rabbits, are shorter than sheep's wool or anything else. And he called it Farida, and it obviously made him successful and probably prestigious. It was knitted, it was also beautifully dyed and embroidered onto silk evening stoles, shawls, there are two up there, bags, and again, learning from here, he very definitely targeted a high-end market. And Alicia's father, Charles, was his agent in London. Grandfather, his agent in London at a time. And he had an agency in New York. And then again, another connection with Japan. The Emperor of Japan bought a full set of his underwear. I can't believe it was Angora underwear. It would have been terribly itchy. But of course he bought 365 of everything, because you have to have one for each day of the year. So he was the best customer.
That's really can I just
yes.
Because we have an apocryphal story here in the mill, which the only proof we have is a kind of it's a piece in the paper in about 1965 where some retiring employees said that John Smedley Limited made the underpants for the Mikado.
Right.
And that he had 365 pairs. So that's...
Well, you see...
So interesting.
Yeah, but I haven't got documentary evidence of that.
Well, I mean, ours is just like hearsay.
Yes, it's the same. But there was a link, wasn't there? Definitely. Yeah. Yeah. It's not really the sort of thing you'd make up, is it? You know. That's fantastic. Yeah, and Fred actually also made outer garments as gifts for the princesses Margaret and Elizabeth, and got permission to give them. And on the back of this, because one problem was moths, and the only thing in those days was camphor balls, he actually invented something he called dye moth, but he didn't patent that, and it's now Moffac, which I don't think we use any longer, but that was one of his things. And quite a lot of the family worked for him at this time. I'll miss that. That's actually a letter. That just shows the mill heading, the headed paper. And there's a letter from Alicia's father written. He used to come and stay with the family here.
And adored them.
Oh, yes,
Fred was adored.
Oh, he was. Yes, I do come to that. He was adored by everybody. I know. Everybody loved him. And in fact, a lot of his workers called their first daughter Brenda after his first daughter. Yeah. And other people who worked for him here, so Alicia's grandfather, he also employed Agnes, his sister, his nephew Bertie, Seward Reeves, another niece of Uncle Bertie. I don't quite know who that is. And I can't believe this, but I have found it. The rabbit hare, his wife's youngest sister, Wynne, was dispatched to Normandy to farm the rabbits. And breed them. And I can't make out if that was a short straw or a cushy number. But he was obviously a man to watch. I mean, apart from anything else, it was a big boost for Matlock, presumably, having this mill going and everything. And he was approached by Viella, who wanted to be able to spin a wool that wouldn't shrink. So he invented a way of combining it with cotton, and thus is all our Clydella school shirts. And he didn't get a proper contract for that. They sent him £10 and he sent it back. He was furious. Anyway, he had 10 successful years here in Derwent Mills, and he sold it to Patton and Baldwin's, and he had a 2-year contract to work for them, and he was never allowed to do any of those processes again, which was fine. He was happy. He'd made quite a lot of money. And he retired to the Lake District, and he bought this beautiful house. It's still there. It's called Summerhill. And he filled it with Chippendale and Chinese jade, Georgian silver, Impressionist paintings. He laid out acres of garden. He bought trees from Kew. He installed a hydroelectric pump to power the house. And in the scullery, he was trying to develop a synthetic chamois leather. But he couldn't. That all got done, and he was just either he was restless or he'd run out of money. I don't know. But he started on his last fatal exercise, which was to build a mill in the nearby market town of Ulverston. That's an archetypal textile mill, isn't it? I mean, Victoria Hall was anything but an archetypal textile mill. Was this what he'd always dreamt of? Was this what he wanted to work in? I don't know. He experimented with spinning feathers, but I don't think that lasted very long. And then he concentrated on his new process, which combines silk and cashmere, ultra-fine gauge for underwear, 3 or 4 ply for sweaters and things. Again, very high-end. Again, he produced a set for the royal family. But this was the 1930s, the luxury market had gone. We don't know. The accepted wisdom in the town now, which is really nice, is that Fred built this mill because he couldn't bear to see all the unemployed people hanging around on street corners. And certainly he did provide employment, but he didn't have a skilled work. They weren't textile workers in Ulverston. That was all iron and steel and things in those days. So I don't know. But we think he had probably overspent at Summerhill. Oh, can you turn that round? Can I turn that round or not?
We'll put our heads on that.
Right, that's the sort of Chinese jade that he had catalogues for. I'm not saying that was the bit he bought, but he bought that sort of thing. He had spent an awful lot of money on this house. But he thought he could do anything, and he thought he could make a success of this Ulvex. But it wasn't to happen. Lucy, his wife, died of cancer in early 1936. He missed her dreadfully. In May of that year, Fred himself, heavily in debt, this is awful, he died of a stroke at the dinner table in front of his 2 teenage daughters. My mother had then married and left home. For all that she was maybe over-forgiving, my mother did make him live again for the family, and she did make us realise how much she and her siblings adored and respected him, as did his nephews. And once he'd found a channel for these talents and skills, he does seem to have been liked and respected. He won numerous regattas in his yacht, which he also designed. His bees produced more honey than anyone else's. He was an ace on the golf course. He could cook. He introduced his daughters to wonderful literature. He bought them quantities of books. He wouldn't let them knit, because machines did that, but he did encourage them to do tapestry, and he invented a better way of having all your colours on different needles at the back, so you only had to pick up one needle and put it through. And he took them on a wonderful trip, the family, on a banana boat to the West Indies and Costa Rica. And by the standards of the time, he was a remarkably hands-on father, I think. I've just ended by saying I wish I'd known him. He'd have been a super grandparent.